At my father's birthday celebration, the name tag I wore read, "The Letdown." My stepmother burst out laughing, and true to her reaction, I stood up, clinked my glass, and declared a toast to the final time they'd ever see me. My dad nearly choked, but the biggest shock came when I walked out, leaving one last message behind. I'm 32, and if you ask my dad, he'd probably say I'm his greatest disappointment. Not because I'm in trouble with the law, not because I'm unemployed, and not because I've done anything truly wrong, but simply because I chose to live life on my own terms rather than follow his plan for me. Instead of following the script he'd drawn up for me, my dad, Richard, has always done things his own way. He's been obsessed with control, appearances, and above all, family loyalty, as long as that loyalty served him. When my parents split when I was 10, it wasn't a messy divorce on the surface, but my dad quickly moved on. Within a year, he remarried Carla, a woman who already had 2 children from her previous marriage, Maxwell and Samantha, and that's when everything started to change. I tried my best. As just a kid, I wanted my dad to be happy. Carla was nice in a superficially sweet, overly enthusiastic way, always putting on a show about how she was uniting the family. She would hug me a little too tight and say things like, "I just know we're going to be best friends." But behind closed doors, it soon became clear that her main priority was her own kids. My dad, who had once been so involved in my life, suddenly shifted focus. He went from being my father to being theirs. At first, it was small things like missing my soccer games while never missing Maxwell's, forgetting to pick me up from school, but always arriving on time for Samantha's dance recital. Then it escalated. By the time I was 14, I was expected to babysit, help with chores they never had to do, and act like a big sister while they got away with everything. If I ever complained, my dad would sigh, as if I was exhausting him, and say they needed more attention because I was older and should be more mature. Carla, on the other hand, didn't mince words. She'd just call me selfish. The breaking point came when my dad drained the savings account my mother had set aside for me, the money meant for my college tuition. My mother fought in court to get that money back, but by then the damage was done. I was livid. I barely spoke to him during my last year of high school, and when I left for college, which I paid for on my own, I only returned for the occasional holiday. Years passed, and our relationship never really healed. I still got invitations to family gatherings, but they always felt more like obligations than genuine attempts to reconnect. In the eyes of my dad and Carla, I was simply the difficult child who refused to play along, while Maxwell and Samantha were the golden ones. That brings me to my dad's birthday party. Carla was throwing a huge bash for him, a real over-the-top, invite-everyone affair. I wasn't planning on attending, but my aunt, one of the few relatives who truly supported me, convinced me to stop by for a while. She said maybe things had changed. Spoiler, they hadn't. The moment I walked in, I felt that familiar, unwelcome tension. People I hadn't seen in years were there, but instead of warm welcomes, I received only polite nods. Conversations flowed around me, yet no one truly included me. I saw my dad laughing with some old friends across the room, but when his eyes met mine, his smile flickered for just a split second, as if he was surprised I'd actually shown up. I began regretting coming when I noticed a small table near the entrance with name tags. Carla had done this before at similar events, insisting it helped people mingle. It was her signature move. Most tags simply read, Uncle Dave, Cousin Lisa, Neighbor John, but then I saw mine, and I froze. My tag didn't just have my name, it had an extra line that made my stomach drop. I picked it up and stared, and from across the room, I heard that familiar laugh. Carla was watching me with a wine glass in hand and an amused smirk on her face. I clenched the tag, my heart racing. This was not going to go as she intended. I stood there for a moment, holding the tag, trying to process what I was reading. It had my name, but beneath it, in smaller letters, someone had written, The Letdown. At first, I thought it might have been a tasteless joke or an unfortunate mix-up by a cousin trying to be funny. But then, I heard her laugh again. I looked up and saw Carla near the bar, sipping her wine like nothing was wrong. Our eyes met, and her smug smirk widened. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. A few people noticed me standing there. Glances passed in my direction with no one saying a word, yet I could feel the pressure, as if they were silently saying, "Don't make a scene." I took a slow breath and put the name tag back on the table, carefully aligning it with the others. For a moment, I almost laughed. Of course, Carla had done this. Classic Carla, not a blatant insult, but a subtle dig. I should have expected it as soon as I walked in. Then a hand touched my shoulder. I turned to see my aunt, the one person in this family who truly understood me. Her brows were furrowed and her lips pressed into a tight line. She had seen the tag and quickly looked toward Carla. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. I forced a tight smile and replied, "I'm fine," even though I wasn't. I was exhausted in a way I couldn't even explain, because this wasn't new, not even the worst thing she'd done. It was just the latest in a long series of little digs that constantly reminded me of my place. I should have walked out right then, should have turned and left, but something inside said, "Not this time." So instead, I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and did something I knew would catch them off guard. I smiled genuinely, as if nothing were wrong, grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing server, tapped it lightly with my nail, and turned back into the room. If Carla wanted a show, I was going to give her one. I raised my glass just a bit, and I could feel the room shift as a few people glanced in my direction. I hadn't caused a scene, not yet, but that quiet tap of my nail on the glass had drawn enough attention to make Carla pause for a moment before taking another slow sip of her wine, her eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out what I was doing. I let the moment linger, almost considering making a toast, then shook my head slightly and moved further into the party. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of seeing me react immediately. The party itself was exactly as I had expected, crowded, overly polished, with expensive catering and meticulously arranged decorations. Carla had spared no effort, as usual, because in her world, everything had to be a performance. It wasn't just about celebrating my father's birthday. It was about showing off how perfect her life was, how loved she and my dad were, and how successful their children had become while I was left on the sidelines. Maxwell and Samantha were already in the center of the room, surrounded by a small group of relatives nodding along as Samantha excitedly talked about her upcoming wedding, with my dad footing the bill for everything. Samantha was smiling as she twirled a huge diamond on her finger, insisting they wanted something classy, a real, elegant wedding, not some tacky Pinterest disaster. I bit back a laugh. Samantha had always been that polished, rehearsed type, perfectly self-absorbed in a way that made sure everything revolved around her without it being too obvious. Meanwhile, Maxwell was leaning casually against the bar, nodding as some of my dad's old friends congratulated him on his new job, which I was pretty sure he hadn't really earned. Maxwell had never really had to work for anything. Every opportunity was handed to him, and every mistake quietly fixed by my father. I was tempted to walk over and join the conversation just to watch them squirm, but before I could, I heard my father say, "Ah." When I turned, he was already making his way toward me, a drink in hand and his expression carefully neutral. "I didn't think you'd come," he said. I forced a smile that wasn't genuine and replied, "I wouldn't miss it." He nodded, scanning the room before looking back at me. "You've been busy, I hear." There it was, the usual careful way he avoided asking about my life. I nodded and said, "Yeah, work's been good. I even bought a house last year." His brow raised slightly. "A house, huh?" he murmured, taking a sip of his drink without another word. That was my dad. He hated it when I did anything that made it impossible for him to see me as the failure he always expected. the version he could pity when others asked about me. I could sense him searching for a remark, a subtle jab, but before he could say anything, Carla's voice cut through the chatter like a knife. "Well, at least you're finally doing something responsible," she said, as she stepped next to him, her smile way too sharp. In that instant, I felt the heat rise in my chest again. I turned to her. She was grinning as if she were genuinely happy to see me, but I recognized that look all too well. Carla was the kind of person who could insult you right to your face, and if you got upset, she'd claim you were the problem. It was always brushed off as just a joke. You were too sensitive. I should have walked away, should have let it go, but I didn't, because something about that night, about the whole situation, just wasn't sitting right with me. Maybe it was the name tag. Maybe it was that my dad had barely acknowledged me before casually dismissing me. Or maybe it was that everyone in that room was a stranger pretending to be family. Whatever it was, I was done. I turned to Carla and, tilting my head slightly, said, "I was going to let it go, but I have to ask, whose idea was it to do the name tag?" For a brief moment, I saw a flicker in her eyes. "Oh, come on," she laughed. "You always take things too personally." I nodded and said, "Yeah, right, hilarious," as she shrugged while sipping her wine. "Maybe if you spent less time being angry, you'd be—" I raised a finger to cut her off. "Actually," I said calmly, "I think you're right." Her eyes narrowed a bit, as if asking, "What do you mean?" I continued, raising my glass a bit more, because now I have a joke too. She blinked in surprise, and my dad shifted uncomfortably beside me. Then I smiled slowly and announced, "I'd like to make a toast." Immediately, the room quieted, not all at once, but gradually as people turned toward me, intrigued, because who doesn't love an unexpected toast? I could feel my dad tense up beside me. Carla let out a soft laugh and shifted her stance as if trying to brush me off. "Oh, come on, you don't have to," she said. I raised my hand and replied, still smiling, "No, really, I insist." The atmosphere shifted even more as more people looked over with curious murmurs. Some guests even grabbed their drinks, thinking it was just light banter, unaware of what was coming. Carla's smile tightened, but she kept her cool, clinging to the idea that I was still the same person who swallowed every insult, who always let things slide, who never really fought back. But my dad wasn't as composed. He knew me better than she did. His grip on his glass tightened, and for the first time that evening, he looked directly at me. Not from afar, not around me, but squarely at me. I let the silence build as anticipation grew, then finally raised my glass to him. In a light, almost conversational tone, I began addressing him, and Carla too, because without them, I wouldn't have learned one of the most valuable lessons of my life. I paused to sip my champagne slowly. Carla let out a soft, almost dismissive laugh. "Oh boy, here we go," she muttered. A few people chuckled, thinking I was about to make a self-deprecating remark. Maybe smooth things over like I always did. But I smiled and said, "No, really, I mean it. Because I believe we often learn the most from those who challenge us, don't you?" I looked at my dad and said, "Dad, you always told me that family is supposed to lift each other up, to support one another, and to celebrate our successes." My father's throat bobbed as he gulped and tightened his hold on his drink. He clearly didn't like where this was going. I used to believe in his words, but then I realized something important. The room was nearly silent now. Carla's fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly I half expected it to snap. I set my glass down carefully on the table beside me and said, "I've come to see that for some people, support only exists if you fit the role they've designed for you. As long as you play the part, the golden child or the black sheep, they'll keep you right where they need you. And if you step out of line," I exhaled sharply and shook my head, "that's when they show you their true colors." I noticed a few uneasy shifts in the crowd, people glancing at each other, Samantha looking at my dad, waiting for his reaction before deciding how she felt. I saw Maxwell smirking, as if this were mere entertainment, while Carla continued smiling, though her knuckles turned white. I used to think that if I just proved myself, worked hard, succeeded, followed the rules, they'd see me differently. But now, I know it was never really about what I did or didn't do. Carla opened her mouth, probably to interrupt, but I let her be. I shifted my gaze back to my dad because in the end, I was never meant to succeed. His expression flickered for a moment, and I let that linger before exhaling and rolling my shoulders back. But I had built something for myself, a life that had nothing to do with this dysfunctional family. And believe me, it's been the most peaceful, fulfilling thing I've ever done. I could see the questions forming on people's faces, the doubt and curiosity because they had no idea what I was talking about. I was done letting them believe the version of me that Carla and my dad had carefully crafted over the years. Carla let out another forced laugh, trying to regain control of the room. "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. It's just a name tag," she said. I looked at her and replied smoothly, "Yes, it is, but it also represents a pattern, a lifetime of moments, little digs, subtle jokes, little reminders that no matter what I do, in your eyes, I'll always be the letdown." My dad finally cleared his throat and stepped forward slightly. "That's enough," he said. I met his gaze head on and he added, "I agree. It is enough." Then, before anyone could react, I picked up my glass again, raised it a bit, and let my next words settle over the room. "For the last time you'll ever see me." The silence was overwhelming. My dad stiffened, and Carla's jaw dropped slightly before snapping shut. Someone in the back muttered, "Wait, what?" Then, without another word, I set my glass down, turned on my heel, and walked toward the door. I could feel everyone watching, feel the panic creeping in, because this wasn't like my previous exits. I took one final look back before stepping out, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was leaving a fight. I was moving toward freedom, toward peace, toward the life I had built away from the endless drama of my family. Outside, I took a deep breath as the cool night air filled my lungs. It was over. I had severed ties the way I should have long ago. There was no more pretending, no more trying to win approval from people who never truly cared about me unless I fit their ideal image. I drove home in silence that night, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders with every mile. Yet even as I sat alone in my quiet living room later, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far, if I had been too harsh. The next few days blurred together with texts and calls I didn't answer. I avoided social media, knowing it would be filled with fallout from my dramatic exit at my dad's birthday party. I had publicly humiliated him and Carla, my stepmother, who I'd always felt was trying to sideline me in favor of her own perfect world. The family group chat exploded with messages, but I stayed silent, unsure if I could face the inevitable confrontation. Eventually, I received a text from my aunt, the one person who had always understood me, asking if I was okay. I didn't know what to say. I replied that I was okay, better than I'd ever been, yet still uncertain, and told her that I needed time. She didn't push further. The next morning, my dad called and asked, in that familiar tone that always implied I was disappointing him no matter what I did, "Where are you?" I answered, "I'm at home." Then I added, "I'm not coming back." His silence said it all. "You can't just leave like this, you know," he eventually said after a long pause. "We have to stick together as a family." I didn't hesitate. Not if sticking together meant pretending to be someone I'm not. Not anymore. That was the last time we spoke. Weeks passed, and I avoided all family events. Weddings, birthday parties, anything they organized. The rest of the family either sided with my dad and Carla's view of me, or pretended nothing had happened. I heard through the grapevine that my dad was hurt, that Carla was furious, and that my siblings were disappointed in me for making a scene, but none of it bothered me. I knew I had done what was right for me. I was still living my life, still thriving, and while I wasn't entirely happy about cutting everyone off, I felt a kind of peace I hadn't experienced in years. I haven't spoken to any family member since that day. So now I ask, am I in the wrong for walking out like that, for making the toast and severing ties completely? Did I go too far, or was it finally time to stand up for myself? I know I'll never gain my dad's approval or be the daughter he always wanted, but perhaps I finally realized that I don't need to live up to anyone else's expectations. Let me know. Was I out of line, or was this long overdue? If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, be sure to like, subscribe, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Do you think I went too far, or was the fallout completely justified?